Hello, everybody, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, Master of Lore and Storyteller Extraordinaire. Today, we're going to be talking about designing and setting up encounters for your players, regardless of the type of game or setting you have in mind. Now, when it comes right down to it, ideally, you should have already talked to your players first, figured out what type of a campaign they're looking forwards to, and what kind of characters they want to play as. So, with this in mind, you can set up and structure your campaign and the encounters throughout in order to, let's say, be appropriate to the setting and what they're looking for and be reasonably well balanced for them. Um, Really, the types of encounters you throw at your players is going to depend, well, entirely on the game and the setting that you're playing around in. For example, Shadowrun is going to be more focused on small team actions, investigating and planning, rather than it is large scale fights or anything really done out in the open. If Shadowrun, if anything's gone out in the open, things have gone sideways really bad. And then we have Dark Heresy, where it's focused on similar kind of rules, but it does have some rules in play to allow for larger encounters using larger numbers of enemies, typically in the form of your disposable fodder, your basic grunts, and the like. But again, really what this is going to boil down to is the style of play that you and your players are looking to get out of your game sessions. Now, if your players are wanting to something, say, let's say a more combat focused kind of campaign, something with a war as the main focus. Now, the players, their characters can go ahead and go through and fight the war, but it's going to be more the backdrop and setting, the dressing up, the props. It helps to set the tone and the mood, and it gives a clear idea on the style of play and the objectives that are at play for this campaign setting. Now, just bear in mind here that very few systems are really built to handle large numbers of combatants. The D20 system, especially as you're rolling, you have to roll initiative, you have to roll attacks. It all gets to be bogged down pretty quickly the more and more characters that you have in a combat sequence. Now, uh, you might some things you might do to help kind of ease and smooth that over is to treat large groups of NPCs as just one unit and roll an initiative. And this works out pretty well considering that, well, if you're doing a fantasy sort of setting or even a more modernish or sci-fi type of setting, enemy units move as a unit. They'll move in formation, they'll move as a squad, they'll typically try to act and coordinate as one. So it makes sense to roll initiative for the entirety of the unit. An exception might be as if say that they have a named captain in them, an antagonist that you've built up a little bit. Maybe not the primary antagonist, but still somebody with a higher degree of skill and represents a larger threat to the players. For the rest of the units, roll them as one, but for this more specialized character that you have in play, roll their initiative separately. That way, you're able to cut down and minimize the amount of work that you're having to do. And the other thing I like to do and recommend for you is to kind of house rule in a morale check kind of system. Now, there's plenty of games and books out there that have similar things, and it's not all that hard to implement within your own game. But the idea is that especially if you're doing a large combat where there's too many units at play for you to really throw in, just kind of roll to see how the units around are doing, both enemies and allies for the players. Say if just to give you an example of how this might work in your game, say you roll at a morale check for the allies of the player characters. If they're doing well, well then they're pushing back against the enemy. They're performing well in combat, so fewer enemy units are going to be getting to the section that the players are at because they have to disperse evenly and try to combat this larger, wider threat in order to try to keep things on an even level. So fewer enemy reinforcements coming to the players, more allies coming to the aid of the players potentially, and all around things will just move a little bit more smoothly, and it gives a more hopeful tone to the combat setting. But if the opposite happens, the player's allies start rolling poorly for their morale checks, and their enemies are doing okay to even great, then their allies, the rest of the soldiers, are being pushed back from the battlefield. So, and since the players, being that they're player characters and have a greater strength of resolve and ability, they're not falling back. They're this exposed hard point that the enemy needs to rout and overcome. So more enemy units are going to be descending on the player characters, and there's going to be fewer allies, and it's going to be harder to escape as well. It's going to be easier for them to be encircled unless they make a conscious decision to fall back with the rest of the army. So it makes it seem like more of a grinding onslaught where they're just slowly pushing back and things aren't looking too good. And if both sides end up rolling pretty evenly with each other, then you just got a grinding slog where people are just pressing in, this mass of bodies, shield walls and spear lines just going and stabbing at each other, trying to create that break in the enemy line. And that'd be the point of the morale check system overall, is especially if you're doing any kind of a historical-ish modern, or a historical-ish setting, or even a high fantasy setting. The goal isn't really to just kill your enemy, wipe them out down to the last man. The idea is you want to break your enemy and force them to flee the field of battle. Trying to kill everybody down to the last man is expensive, and if you're conquering territory, you kill everybody, there's nobody left to inhabit that territory, to work those lands or make them profitable in any way. It sort of defeats the purpose. I mean, you still gain territory, but now you're spread thin with few resources and few options on hand. Which brings me to the next part here. When it comes to this larger combat kind of styled setting that you have, you're going to want to plan out the goals for each army. The goal of obviously is to beat each other, but how do they go about doing that? What are the overall objectives? What's the grand strategy in question here? Good generals are going to have a lot of this stuff planned out in advance, and then they're going to have their contingencies and contingencies upon contingencies. At least good generals will. If you're playing a campaign where you have crappy generals or even mediocre ones, and it happens, throw that out there. Emphasize, that there's a unified, well, not a unified, but a lack of cohesion, a very simplistic plans, not very well thought out plans. But with good generals, there's going to be plans upon plans, and they're going to be using different terrain features as part of these strategies, and they're going to pay attention to the effects of the weather. And if there's any magic involved, then that's going to alter their plans and contingencies as well. My recommendation for kind of having a rough layout of this is to have kind of a flow chart set up for each side, and they kind of mirror each other, and use these plans of actions to kind of be act like different events going over the course of the battle for the players to go through. They'll represent different encounters that they'll have as you go along this setting, and they'll also work as player objectives well, which gives them their own little missions, side quests, etc. And this is where we come up to with the fact that this type of a setting doesn't just have to be straight combat all the time. Um, Anytime you go into a war, there's going to be plenty of that, and that's going to be the big focus. But even then, you're still going to want to change things up for your players just to make it a little bit more interesting for them. I mean, how much fun does it sound like the night before the big battle, the general dispatches the players on a mission to make a midnight raid on the enemy camps. The goal is to just attack, harass, destroy supply lines, weaken whatever fortifications they have. And if they're successful, the effect of this can be weaker enemy units, lower morale, ruined fortifications, or even fewer or no artillery at all located within the enemy's arsenal after the players make a successful raid. It can do a lot to alter the course of the battle and make things much more favorable, and the player characters are well suited for this, given that, well, they're player characters. They have better stats, generally better equipment. They're much more specialized unit, and they're designed and put together to work as a unit, so works out really well. Or you could even do a thing where the players are assigned to spying on the enemy camp, learning the formations, what units are there. Um, Old medieval historical battles, different units had different levels of experience to them. They had, well, take like the German Landsknechts. I'm sure I'm butchering that name, but these Landsknechts were German mercenaries, and they used big two-handed greatswords, and they were absolutely feared in battle, and they were very, very colorfully dressed. It was hard to miss them on the battlefield, but if they were coming at you, crap, were you screwed. So, that could be the kind of thing that the players are sent out to spy on, looking for specialized units like that. Or even they could be assigned to assassination missions, picking off a general, a captain, or even removing a powerful spellcaster from the battlefield before it's even begun. The options here are a lot of fun. Or you could even do here's one for you. You could even do one where the players are dispatched, and the bard in particular is assigned to go and meet with a particular unit or its commanders, and convince them to either um, to turn on the enemy army or to just flee the field of battle. Convince them that there's no hope or it's in their best interest to just go away. They'll be pardoned, forgiven, they'll be integrated into the new military, rewarded, heaped on with riches, fame, and awards, anything to get them to flee the battlefield. I mean, it's pretty devastating to have, a whole block infantry unit to just vacate their spot on the battlefield. It leaves a big opening there for an enemy army to exploit. So even one unit leaving can be devastating if the opportunity is exploited quickly and properly, which a good general is likely to do. But whatever you do, like I said, switch it up on the players. All of these things are within the realm of possibility for a combat heavy campaign, and the players could easily be assigned to defend against such actions or incursions from the enemy army upon their own camps. I mean, after all, war is politics by other means. And speaking of, if your players are wanting something that's a little bit more intrigue focused, a little bit more heavy with the cloak and dagger kind of campaign, well, that's easy to pull off within this war setting as well. Actually, it's easy to pull off even without a war. I mean, hell, anytime you have large groups of people vying for different goals or objectives or positions of power, there's it's just good storytelling to have that little bit of underhandedness and political backstabbery. Makes definitely for a very interesting and very fun game. I mean, you think about it. Anytime you have a nation, city, state, large groups of people, there are going to be differences of opinion. I mean, just take a look at how it is here on Earth. I mean, we have multitudes of cultures, religions, ideas, and just viewpoints on even commonly shared and held facts. Now just imagine how much that multiplies if you're spreading to multiple planets, or you have multiple other races like dwarves, elves, necrons, or tau, free spirits, or AI. My point is, even a simple thing, a simple idea, like passing just a regular, normal law, can get complicated just by there being so many different people involved that could be potentially affected by that particular law. And to get things done, you have to be able to influence a great number of people. Or better yet, for a cloak and dagger campaign, you have to know how to influence the right people. I mean, any particular faction is going to have its movers and shakers within those factions, and the bigger the faction, the more influence those movers and shakers have. So, this type of a setting and campaign, a lot of the knowledge skills are really going to come in handy here. Knowledge of politics, economics, nobility, any kind of royalty, powerful merchant families, or even local knowledge is really going to come into play and serve the players well, especially if you're taking the time to set this sort of campaign up right. If you're going to do a cloak and dagger campaign like this, you have to have this kind of thing ready and prepared ahead of time with, again, plenty of details and story involved within all of this to make it flow right and make it work properly and to set up all of these encounters. And really, it's going to help with the players being able to establish their objectives, especially for a cloak and dagger campaign like this. You don't always have to make the goal immediately clear, or maybe the goal is clear, but the means of getting there aren't. Saying the myriad of options, again, is just really limitless here. So the players can use these knowledge skills to figure out what their objectives are and what the means are for getting there. And so, if the means are, say, meeting with someone in order to get them to change their viewpoint on a particular subject and view it in just the right light, well, great. There you go. You have a mission idea. Get a meeting with this particular NPC and roll some diplomacy checks with them and dialogue it out to see if you can't get them to shift. If he doesn't want to shift his position, well, it's a person with a position of power. They're bound to have some skeletons in their closet, right? Even if it's not their own closet specifically, maybe they've covered for somebody else, use their position and influence to sweep a few things under the rug that might be damaging for people within their own faction. That can be used as a great deal of leverage by some clever players. And even if they can't dig that up, well, in a big faction where there's influence and power to be had, there's bound to be a few people gunning for that particular NPC's position. How hard could it be to smoke one out and see about getting another NPC put into the leader's place there? And surely after that happens, they'd be happy to give a favor in return and maybe even view that particular point just the right way and get their entire group to be moving in a direction favorable to the player's goals. And fighter types can absolutely have a role in this kind of a campaign. Again, you're always going to be wanting to switch things up on your players to keep them on their toes. For example, players engaging in this kind of cloak and dagger business are eventually just going to become targets themselves. They're capable agents. You got to remove those pieces from the board there in order to weaken your rival's power base. So let's say the above NPC for their faction, they've been removed and a new person has been leveraged into place there. And he's promised to give the players support, but, well, now there's a problem. This particular bard or rogue that they met with, uh, they know too much. They know about what happened here, and that's potentially destabilizing, especially if the players ever decide to use that as blackmail or just release that and completely annihilate their position within their own faction. So they're going to send their own assassins after the player to remove them and make sure that all the loose ends are tied up properly. Now, with this type of a setting, ideally you should be uh, having this set up to where your players are already thinking in lateral movements like this. They're going to be using their knowledges and gathering information in order to make the checks necessary. Maybe they get a tip that, hey, you've been greenlit. There's a couple of guys coming after you and they mean business. It's not going to be pretty for you. Well, if the players get the tip in time and they know what's about to happen, well, they can just lead their assassins along towards the character's demise and just take them down this nice, quiet, dead end alley. Perfect for the assassins. Great place to corner a target. Well, after they corner the target, that's when you have the fighter and the ranger step out around the corner with the mage behind them. Now the assassins are trapped and flanked within this alley. Their target on one side and two very powerful, capable, combat capable people right there. And the wizard just throws down a silence spell and a quick illusion so that nobody can see or hear what's happening down in this alleyway while the players dispatch the assassins. Now, maybe they keep one to interrogate or they kill them both and send I don't know, send their heads back to the guy that hired them as a message saying, hey, don't screw with us, buddy. We're better at this game than you. It's best if you just kind of play along at this point. Oh, and by the way, that's another favor you owe us now. This type of cloak and dagger thing can be a lot of fun and really interesting if you set this up right for the characters. But again, you're only limited by your imagination on this. And the more details you can pack into this story, the more you build the story up and get the setting put together properly, the easier this all comes out and the better it all gets set up. But where you've really got to step things up, regardless of the kind of setting and play style that you have going here, is the final encounter with the story's primary antagonist. You really want to try and set the scene as well as you can, have everything set up and prepared ahead of time. Well, this can require a little bit of adaptability on your part. I mean, if you're playing with a group of players that work together really well and they're a bunch of clever little bastards, they may catch the antagonist off guard and get them on ground that's favorable to your players. Even then, you still want to make it challenging, whether it's combat, stealthy, or socially oriented. This is the primary antagonist. They are adaptable, they are powerful, they are incredibly capable at the means that they have at their disposal. They are good at what they do, so that should be reflected, and it should challenge the players a great number of different ways, and it should just be difficult all the way around. But that just makes it all the more rewarding when the players overcome that challenge, especially if they have been clever and found ways to throw the primary antagonist off their game. It just makes it so much more fun. But with that said, let me go ahead and just give you some general tips for setting things up. Always remember that all of this is going to be, you want to build all of this with story in mind. What is the story? Is it make for good storytelling? Does it make things interesting? But that said, there's a lot of little things that you can do here to help make your encounters just a little bit more interesting, challenging, or if you're feeling a bit dastardly, deadly for your players. For example, one of my favorite things is to pair encounters with traps and hazardous terrain features. I mean, even if it's just something like an obvious pit trap, if you pair it with a couple of really high strength characters, this you can use those characters to knock the players into the pits, try to push them down into the pits for a bit of extra damage. This also removes the characters from combat for a couple of rounds as they're trying to climb out of these pits. Even if it's just an extra round, maybe 2 rounds, that's a great deal of advantage for these NPCs, and it gives them an opportunity to deal a bit more damage and be quite a bit more of a threat to the players. Also, another favorite of mine, putting casters in a room with a lot of big statues and giving them the animate objects spell yields all kind of exciting results. Hopefully, one of your players, mage or sorcerer or whatever, has a disintegrate or a mud to rock spell handy. It's a good way of getting around that. But again, just nothing like seeing the surprise on the players' faces, or that oh crap moment as when the statues start moving and animating at the whim of the caster. Also, speaking of using casters, casters with a stone shaped spell and some cleverly concealed pit traps will work wonders for you. If you're feeling extra cruel, down in those pit traps, throw down like an ooze or some poisonous vermin creatures or venomous lizards. Really, especially if it's something that's going to have a poison that affects the character strength score, really makes it a bit extra challenging for them to try to climb out, and they're constantly being bit or chewed on by these creatures, or if it's an ooze, slowly being melted away. It's that one might be a bit much there, but had an instance once where had this particular kind of a setup. The caster managed to maneuver a couple of the players over a pit trap that they didn't know was there. Used stone shape wand to drop the players down in a 40-foot pit with spikes at the bottom, and there's a bunch of snakes down in there. And then most of them, I think only one character actually managed to climb out of the trap, and the other two, well, the wizard just used the stone shape wand again and just slammed the stone shut over them. So they're trapped in the dark, on spikes, with poisonous creatures just gnawing away at them, just pumping their veins full of venom. It was pretty awful, but I got some good laughs out of that one. But another thing you can do to make things a little bit more interesting is to change up how you present certain enemies. Like take your quintessential ogre, ogre with a big ass wooden club. It's a classic and a staple for a reason. But you can make those ogres just a little bit more interesting by giving them an ogre-sized spear. Now you can dress it up a little bit more, make it definitely a more durable spear. You know, this large, thick oaken haft with iron bands running down it to give it a little bit of extra strength. And the beauty is, spears really don't take a whole lot of training for them to be effective. There's a reason why every culture on Earth has developed a spear of some sort and made a great deal of use of it. Across all kinds of battlefields, across so many different periods of history. I mean, we still make use of similar things by mounting bayonets on the end of rifles. It still is. It's not quite the same length as the old-fashioned spears, but it's still a similar idea and concept, and it doesn't take a great deal of training for it to be effective, and it makes those ogres quite a bit more interesting and challenging at the same time. I mean, that reach effect, man, trying to move up carefully through it, just through its threatened area, doesn't work out so well. But again, that's just one of those little extra things, and it changes things up just a little bit. And another thing you can do if you're doing something more Shadowrun or D20 Modern or whatever other kind of game setting, if you use snipers in real life, they try to scout out the terrain ahead of time. If they can, they'll try to identify positions that give them good sight lines that they can fire down range on and put fire down on enemy targets while still minimizing the chances that they're going to be spotted or even take return fire. And after they fire, they're going to move. They're going to try to move quietly, stealthily if they can. If they need to, they'll book it, but they'll move up to the next shooting point. That way they can confound and confuse and harass their targets, in this case, the players. And even better, most snipers will typically have a spotter with them to help pick targets, identify the distances, windage, and watch their backs too. So it really turns these characters into a deadly opponent, and they really don't have to be all that high level, as they're going to be attacking from a distance, and they're going to be typically shooting at characters that are flat-footed to them. They're not going to have their full defenses up, and really the targets don't always have to be the player characters either. Again, if you're going with a cloak and dagger styled sort of setting, if the player's objective is to extract a particular target so that they can interrogate them and get more information out of them, then all the sniper really has to do to be effective in that moment, they don't have to shoot at the players. They just got to shoot the target that they're trying to extract. If you're doing a modern setting, no magic, no fantasy type of stuff, you know, target gone. They now have to pursue other avenues of investigation in order to achieve their goals. If it's a fantasy styled sort of setting with clerics that can use speak with dead spells, that will help mitigate that loss. But there's a little bit of the cleric's particular level in question when it comes to speak with dead. They're limited to a certain number of questions per week. So if the players don't have a clear or well thought out line of questioning ahead of time, it may take them a couple of weeks to try to get the information that they need, maybe even over a month. And a month is a lot of time for an enemy faction, especially a shadowy organization, to make their move. So you can really make a good marksman or a good sniper a really effective tool in your arsenal. Another good one is to use rogues or monks on spellcasters. Pretty dang hard for a wizard to start casting spells when they're choking on a garrote around their neck. But these are just a few ideas. Just remember, you need to build your encounters up mainly around the story and the setting that you have. Top it off with a few random encounters to throw in there, keep the players on their toes and make it interesting. And you should be coming out with a campaign that's a lot of fun for you to run and a lot of fun for your players to get through. Anyways, I think that's about it for now. Thank you very much for your time. If you enjoyed this particular part of the DM series or the DM guide, please hit like and subscribe. Check out the other videos. Click that bell icon so that you get more notifications on when I have more content coming down the line for you folks. I've been Jordan, your resident storyteller and master of lore. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good night.